Matthew. Matthew is going to talk to us about high availability related to IBMI, related to the cloud. Please give Matthew a hand.
Hi, everybody.
Matthew, would you mention that we'll take the photo right after this session before we leave for lunch?
I'll mention that right now. So straight after the session, if you can all accumulate at the front of the hall, we'll take a picture, and just before we go for lunch. So this is to go in that photo frame that you'll see outside. So I'm Matthew Ashton. I work for Maxava. Maxava is a sponsor of iBelieve, but has been supporting and developing HA solutions for the IBMI for 14, 15 years. And my role within Maxava is to develop and roll out their global strategy on a global basis. So that's me, my title there. I've been with Maxava this year. Prior to that, I worked for a customer, an IBM customer for 15 years. I worked for the Pearson Group, so a rather large education organization globally. So I see this from both sides. I see it from an ISV and a vendor perspective, but I also have a very keen understanding of how it works within a customer's environment as well. So just very briefly, one of these over there, we have Maxava supports and sponsors the iFoundation. And what this is about is that Maxava have handed out around $250,000 over the past 4 years to the promotion of IBMI, of education for people working on IBMI, and user groups such as your own, such as Poland, Common Poland, can apply for a grant, and that is then put to good use. It's put to good use of getting people like Alison, Dr. Frank Soltis, and people to stand up in front of you and talk about what is going on within IBM, but also then for education for your user group. These are the topics I'm going to go through. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey around disaster recovery, around what cloud is, and so starting out with disaster recovery, what that is, what cloud is, and then choosing a partner should you choose to move your disaster recovery into the cloud, where you no longer want to manage it within your own organization, but you want to put it out into a cloud provider to manage it. And I'll tell you some of the gotchas. I've managed data centers around the UK and Europe for a long time, and I've had to engage with suppliers, engage with partners, and I will be taking you through some of the considerations that you might have when you're deciding on a partner and whether you're going to move your disaster recovery into the cloud. So before that starts, each year I go off to France during the summer. I like quite a sedate holiday. I go walking in the Alps. It's all very lovely. The sun is generally shining over the summer. And that's fine if you're going to France or Switzerland. However, if you're going to go to New Zealand, down there, you go white river rafting. You might jump off a bridge if you are so inclined with a rubber band attached around your feet, as people at the back of the room have done. I'm not one for taking my life into or giving it to somebody else to manage with a rubber band. So what we decided to do was take a little System I, as it was in those days, and put it in a white river rafting raft and send it over and see how it fared coming out the other side. So here's just a little skit.
Don't worry, you're not going to get wet.
So that's a little IBM 270. It went off and it recovered. It was dried off, and I'll show you at the end of this presentation how we dried it off, and it was put back into service. It's perfectly fine. As we all know, it's a very robust platform that we work on today. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to change the resolution because I'm going to lose half of my presentation. Okay, it's not as good as it was, but that'll do. Okay. So what is a disaster? So a disaster is an unplanned and sudden event that causes major disruption to your business. And there are many examples of disasters around. There are political disasters that are very high profile, but there's also been horrific natural disasters around the world, and in more recent years, whether that's the advent of 24-hour news broadcasting, but we all know about these events that have gone on. And then the definition of disaster recovery. Well, these are sets of processes and procedures that you put in place within your organization to recover from a disaster and bring your business back up and running in a very short period of time. So I've had a look at the type of disasters that might have hit Poland, and if you have a look over the past, it's actually 30 years, there have been 37 major disasters within Poland. The majority of them, 24 of them, are due to flood or storm damage. And there was a major where a river burst its banks and major devastation within Poland. And these things have a huge impact on the economy, on businesses running. And then we have things like the trade hall here where there was so much snow on the roof that the roof collapsed and life was lost and business was interrupted, and the cost of these events, if you look over 30 years, $8.26 billion US, that's a lot of money. So it shows that disasters have a major impact. So I'm hoping those of you who are customers have considered the impact of said event. It's an insurance policy. We hope and pray that these things don't happen to our businesses, but there is a chance that they might. So if we have a look at why organizations choose to implement an HA solution, so this is where companies have decided that the cost of downtime is such that they can't afford to maintain if there is a disaster. Your customer expectations, so the customers that are interfacing and interacting with your organization, they might have a very particular need to have systems. Gone are the days when your systems didn't work 24/7, or at least close to 24/7. I remember the day back when I was working for a bank in South Africa on a System 36, as it was in those times. On a Friday afternoon, we'd do a backup and I'd switch the machine off. And I'd go home for the weekend. There was no mobile phone, there was no VPN access, so I didn't have to do anything. There was no way I could work over a weekend. On a Monday morning, I'd come in before anybody else and switch the machine back on again. It was ready to run for the following week. Those days are long gone. We just don't have those days anymore. People expect to have systems available 24/7. And of course, eliminating data loss. Many companies today will say, especially banks and high transaction number organizations, that if they lose their transactions, they're losing big money. So these companies go and implement HA. I worked for Edexcel, it's an education provider in the UK, and back in 2003, we had a paper-based way of managing exam scripts. So we have candidates sitting at school. Those candidates will fill in an answer sheet. We would take those answer sheets into our organization and mark them. So you would be a teacher or a head teacher sitting at home, and you would mark these exam scripts. When they come back into the organization, we would then capture the marks off those exam sheets, and we would have those marks, and we would do some analytics of the marks, and eventually a candidate on the 18th or 20th of August each year would get a result. We couldn't slip that date. It had to be delivered on that specific day each year. If we missed the date, we lost data. It would have a dramatic impact on those candidates at school because they wouldn't get to university, and it would have a knock-on impact on the economy. So it was decided at the time that we would implement a high availability solution because we couldn't afford to have data loss within our organization. One of the points on the previous slide there was about having a business continuity plan. Now, within organizations today, very often, a business continuity plan, the business will come to IT and say, we need a business continuity plan. And that's all good and well, but my belief is that that business continuity plan should be owned by the business. And of course, IT is a big part of business today, and it will be called for within that business continuity plan that IT provides support, and that support we provide should take the form of a disaster recovery plan. And that is just one of the elements of the overall, how do we recover our business? If we can't get into our building, or our building is washed away because of some storm, our main building, how many people do we need to get to our second building? And of course, if there is a disaster, what's the first thing that people are going to be concerned about if there is a disaster that is a natural disaster and possibly has an impact on their home life? The first thing they're going to think about is not the company that we work for and pays our salary, it's about making sure our families are okay. That has to be number one for us personally. Once we've made sure that our families are okay, then we can start considering how we're going to support our business and bringing them back up and getting their systems back up and running. So we go and create a disaster recovery plan. And these are the elements of that disaster recovery plan. It's the who, what, where, when, and how. So who are the people who are going to own bringing our systems back up and getting them running? How are we going to get staff back into a building somewhere to start running our business again, start taking those transactions in, start doing the analytics, or whatever else it is that our businesses do to make money, to add to our country's economy. When we're talking about disaster recovery, we talk about it in terms of the RTO, the recovery time objective, and the recovery point objective. So a company, such as a bank, might have a very, very short recovery point objective. They can't afford to lose any data. And the recovery point is the last transaction that you're able to recover to in the case of a disaster. So if you're using tapes, you could lose up to 23 hours and 59 minutes and the number of seconds worth of data. Should you do a backup once every day, you get to the following day, and the minute before you're going to take that backup, you have a major catastrophic event that means that you have now got to recover from the tape you took a day before. That's your recovery point objective. You've now lost possibly 23 hours, and companies today are trying to shrink that recovery point. And then the recovery time objective is how quickly you can recover your systems. Doesn't mean you've got to take the tape that you have now taken 23 hours before, load it onto a system, bring the system back up and running. Still today, reloading an operating system on an IBM I is not the quickest thing, and that goes for any computer out there. So what do? Well, we created it's a little recovery calculator. So over on the left-hand side, right in the middle here, you have your disaster point. This is when everything blows up. Over here, it might be, if you're using tape, well, you've got possibly a day of data that you have now lost. And then you've got to recover your system, and that might take you a day or 2 days or 3 days. If you've got to go to your business partner or go to IBM, say, Mr. IBM, could I please have yet another IBM I system so I can recover my organization? And what we try to do is get it as close on both sides of this disaster so that when a disaster strikes, you lose as little data and it takes you as little time to recover your system in the future. Over time, things have evolved. We see our platform, the IBM I platform, and operating system evolving as we move into newer technologies using cloud because there is so much prevalence in the cloud. Back in the day, we used to do our tape backups, and I've spoken about tape. You may, instead of going and buying a second machine, you go to SunGard or IBM and saying, well, can I please take a piece of space on your IBM I in your data center? When my systems fail, I'll bring my tapes, load them on your system, and bring them back up again. We can do some testing, put a network in place, and it means that you can continue your business from an IT perspective with one of these service partners. Data vaulting, instead of using tape, you send your data, your backup data, across a network, and somebody has your data somewhere else. You might be able to do that more than just once a day. Reducing that recovery time objective, definitely, because it's now you've got all of your data somewhere else and it's sitting on somebody else's machine. But the recovery point is possibly still not perfectly reduced. For many years now, you've been able to buy HA solutions. A number of vendors out there have an HA solution, and that means that you take your production system, you have a second data center with a second machine, and you replicate your data in real time between those two systems. What you've done there is you've really got very close on my recovery graph. You've got your points very close to the disaster. You've got your data in almost real time. You may lose transactions that are in flight across a network at the time your production system fails. But getting that system back up and running again is quite a quick process because all of your data, the operating system is there and it's running. And then we move into the cloud. The cloud is becoming more prevalent. And as you've heard today, why not move your IBM I or companies providing IBM I in the cloud? Isn't it one of the most secure platforms out there? Dr. Frank said earlier this morning that the security was built into the underlying hardware many years ago. They haven't had to worry about it because it's right down at the hardware level. If you're looking at Intel with Windows sitting on top of it, well, the security has to be done at the operating system level, not at the hardware level, because it wasn't built into the hardware in the first place. If you choose to take the on-premise replication of your environment, you're more than likely going to be using this box over here. The one at the top here gives you disk protection over and above the RAID 5 or the mirroring that you might be doing on your solution, but it doesn't give you facility protection, and neither does it give you overall hardware protection. This one here does. It means that you as an organization, you have your production system sitting in one data center, and you have your backup system sitting in somebody else's data center or your company's second data center. You have a network between the two, and you're replicating your data. And now what we're talking about is moving that second system. You no longer have to have that major capital outlay as you purchase that system, but you move it into a service provider that has a cloud offering to enable you to replicate your data across a network to their secure environment that is sitting in a data center somewhere else. That's what I'm going to be talking to you about in more detail, about the considerations you need to have in your mind as to whether you go to that service provider offered service or keep it in-house. We hear about the cloud all the time. We're probably, if I were to ask anybody in the room, I can imagine that you're using Office 365 or Google or Facebook or Twitter or some of these tools, and these are all founded in the cloud. If you look at what IBM is doing with their soft layer group, they've just established a huge data center in Amsterdam, so there's a lot of investment into cloud solutions. You've got Microsoft with their Azure cloud, you've got Amazon with their Amazon Web Services. They've just built another data center in Frankfurt. So there is a lot of concentration here in Europe, and it is just growing. So what is a private cloud? And that's really where we are still concerned about security. We build our own internal cloud within our organization. It's within our firewall, but we still enable the features that you get out of general cloud support, speed of delivery of your applications. This is something that has possibly held companies back in the past because it takes so long. Your infrastructure department would have to go and buy a new server, establish a new data center, establish a new rack within a data center. Cloud, the whole idea is speed of delivery. and offering services that we can now share rather than each of us go and implement an HR system you can draw down from the cloud. And then what is the public cloud? We all know what that is. Amazon Web Services was probably the pioneer that we all know about in this industry. And this is where they provide us with services running out of their data centers, and they have data centers around the world to support the delivery of those services. And then the hybrid cloud is the software layer where we bridge between the two. Companies will often start with a private cloud, so they get comfortable with the concepts in their own organization. And then we build a software bridge into the public cloud, and that we call the hybrid cloud. It allows you to migrate your services quite seamlessly from your own internal private cloud into the public clouds that are available today. So if we have a look at cloud and how it's grown, Gartner has said that by 2016, cloud computing is going to make up a big chunk of IT expenditure. And then by 2017, 50% of large organizations will have some form of hybrid cloud in place. And that's starting today. I saw it with my previous company. But just before I left, I was involved in deploying both a private and a hybrid cloud for the organization. So this is happening, and it will probably filter down to smaller organizations if they're not using it today already. We've all heard of infrastructure as a service, of software as a service, and now we start talking about disaster recovery as a service. As the cloud is becoming far more prevalent to organizations, and organizations with all of the crises that we've had in the past 6 or 7 years from a financial perspective, with that initial cost to build out your disaster recovery environment, companies are they're reluctant to go and build out their own environment. So they're looking for partners that can offer them the security, but can move their systems into some form of cloud. The global growth of cloud, if we have a look at Europe, where we all sit, it looks like we're lagging behind, and there are a number of reasons why that is. If we have a look at Europe, it's a big place, but there are many cultures, there are many different ways of doing business within Europe. Even though we have the EU, there's still many different ways of doing business. There are security concerns. Each country has its own security policies and concerns that go with those policies. So if you look at Asia and Asia Pacific, that is quite well ahead with cloud, there are a lot of startup companies in that region. And startup companies, how do you get off the ground very quickly? You start using cloud. You move your services into the cloud. The euro crisis has had a major impact on the economies within organizations, so maybe innovation hasn't been as dramatic as it has been in other areas of the world. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, and we Europeans, I don't think that we need to consider ourselves as lagging behind. It's just the state of fact of economies of our organizations and our countries that means that we haven't moved to the cloud. So let's jump on. I'm very passionate about data centers and how they're built and how they're put together. So IT risk is probably one of the most critical reputational risks today for any IT executive. We know that. We often hold the company's prospect in our hands within the IT departments in companies around the world. So this is a little cartoon of Dilbert, and it's Dilbert now has gone to his manager and said, you know what I've done? I migrated our whole data center to the cloud. And he says, but you know what? The cloud stopped working. And I don't have the telephone number for that cloud guy. So his boss says, so what do you mean? You've actually lost our data center? He says, yeah, actually I have, yeah. That's a problem, and we in IT never want to be in that situation. We want to make sure that we have our company's best interests at heart, that if there is a risk to be taken, we mitigate that risk with processes and procedures so that we know who the cloud guy is. We know who to call should there be a failure. We've all been inundated with literature and commentary about security of the cloud. What this wheel is showing you are the concerns that companies were so a bunch of companies were interviewed, and their main concerns about moving to the cloud are highlighted here. So security is the major one. Functionality of what they can get out of the cloud, the reputation of the cloud partner, and that's the point that I'm going to be dwelling on. And then, of course, SLAs, that fits in with reputation and the hardware. But we all know and love hardware. You can put an IBMI anywhere and it will continue running. That's why we all probably use it today. You don't want your IBMI hosted underneath a tent that's got maybe some solar panels to give it power each day. You want something a little bit more robust, something that's a little bit more fortress-like. When you're talking to a data center partner, you want to make sure that they're not in the building next door to yours. So location is really important. You also want to make sure they didn't go and build their own data center on a volcano, because that's also not very handy. You want to make sure that they are reliable, that they've done everything they can do from a risk mitigation perspective, so that when you move your services into their data centers, so they're offering you cloud solutions, that they are well protected. You want to make sure they're testing their data centers on a regular basis, just as you would be doing with your own production data centers. Do they have professional accreditation, and are they owned or hosted? Owned or hosted is not really that important. What is important is that you know that's the case. So that the service provider that you choose might be hosting with somebody else. That means that you don't have a single person to go to unless they have very strong service levels with the data center that they're hosting with. You may have government contracts for your company. We've spoken about security. Government contracts have a major say on how you host your information. When I was working for Pearson, we had a £26 million contract with the UK government over a 3-year period. But they dictated that the infrastructure that I deployed for this specific contract had to be physically separated from all of the other infrastructure. I wasn't allowed to share any part of my infrastructure at all. So there's quite an expense there. And when I went to my disaster recovery environment, there was even more scrutiny because I wanted to make sure that all of the data was protected, that nobody could get inside a cabinet, open up, put a USB stick in front of the IBMI. I suppose you've all done that, right? To steal data off it. Yeah, it doesn't work. But anyway, they wanted to make sure that we had fully protected the environment. Then we talk about service. Your companies will have service levels, you will have service management as part of your daily processes to make sure that services are delivered in an appropriate manner. You want to make sure that your service management policies and procedures are tied well into the partner that you choose to host your cloud environment. And then they've got to be reliable. So I want to go through now. We've spoken about cloud, we've spoken about disaster recovery, and a vendor's location and the type of vendor that you're going to go and host with. But why would your organization choose to move your disaster recovery into the cloud rather than keep it on-premise? Oh, it did. Okay, so what are your business functions? Can you move them off-site? Are you managed by regulatory requirements that dictate that you've got to keep all of the data within your organization, whether that be manufacturing or education or financial, might have a bearing on that. Then I've spoken a lot about that capital expenditure. Does your company have an appetite for saving on the overall capital expenditure and deploying services where there is a monthly fee that is predictable over time? And then maybe your main site is built near a fault line. Maybe it's built near a river or near an airport. You don't want to have your main office underneath a flight path because plane accidents do happen. Rivers do flood. Fault lines in the earth do crack and cause earthquakes. Is there regulations within the industry that dictate what you can and can't do? So you need to take all of these business reasons into consideration if you're going to move your disaster recovery outside to a third-party supplier. And that would go for anything that you move into the cloud. Okay. Do you have the domain knowledge within your organization to manage disaster recovery? Or are you going to move it all out to somebody who's a specialist in this area? If you are going to do that, make sure they are a specialist and aren't just saying they are. Make sure that they have a reputation within the industry. When you move to the cloud, though, make sure you've got very strong vendor management capability within your organization. And don't underestimate. It's fine managing your own IT teams. As a manager of people, it's quite easy to get people to do the right thing. But when you're talking about a vendor on the other side, make sure that you have strong vendor management skills within your organization to be able to manage a vendor who is managing part of your infrastructure for you. And then they've got to have the right network design. Does your network allow for you to move into a cloud solution? Back in 2011, there was an awful earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand. And I had the opportunity to go down there in May this year. Now, I knew there'd been an earthquake, but I was driving around with a friend of mine around New Zealand, and there are loads of car parks. Just gravel areas where there are cars parked in the city. Me being naive, I turned around to this friend of mine and said, "What's with all the car parks?" He said, "No, there used to be buildings there, but all the buildings collapsed as part of the earthquake." And that's pretty horrendous stuff. But there was a building that stood after the earthquake. But the fire brigade went in and told all the people to get out of the building because they didn't know whether it was still safe enough to continue trading within the building. So they all stood outside, but their systems were in that building. They couldn't get in, and the systems were still running, but they didn't know for how long because they were going to cut the power to the building. So one of the problems back in 2011 for this organization was they couldn't fail over to their other site. Now they have the ability to do it because of networking, because of the way that they had deployed networks within the organization changed as a result of this one disaster they had. Now they can fail over to the other data center using a mobile phone. So make sure that you have the right networking skills within your organization or offload it to somebody else. Footprint growth, we've heard about data analytics, big data, there's a lot of data around. Can you handle the data growth? And if you can your partner handle the data growth as well? We expect moving anything into the cloud that you have as much space as you require. A friend of mine, it was my next door neighbor, she turned around and said, "The cloud is just there. Anybody can move anything to the cloud because it's just an infinite amount of compute." And people don't actually understand that just like we are organizations running our systems, running cloud-type solutions, we are just having to build up infrastructure. It doesn't just appear in the cloud. But people out there are quite naive to what the cloud really is. And then, of course, hardware costs. And it comes back to, do you want to buy the hardware or let somebody else buy it and take that risk? These are the areas of general IT infrastructure. You've got hardware costs, you've got maintenance, you've got the footprint costs. And really what we're showing is that using cloud, you come down to a fixed monthly fee. Yes, you've got network costs that you've got to layer on top of that, but it's a fixed monthly fee. You don't have to worry about the maintenance. And in 3 years' time or 4 years' time, when the maintenance of the operating system becomes that expensive, you need to go buy a new machine. The cloud provider handles all of that for you. But we talk about cloud a lot, but it's not for everybody. If you choose not to go to the cloud, that's also okay. Just make sure you've got all of the right processes and procedures within your organization to recover if there is a disaster out there. So I told you that the little 270 that went on the river rafting expedition, it needed to get dry at the end of that before it would go back into production. Now, what better way than to get a nice draft of air over the machine? So in conclusion, I'd like you to take away just these points today. And these are questions about whether you move your DR offsite or keep it in-house. Managing the cloud provider. Does the partner have specialist IBMI skills? We all know and have a lot of specialist knowledge in this room, I'm sure, on IBMI, but does the partner have the same? And are there overall cost savings to be seen by your organization? At the end of the day, it's that bottom line for your organization. Thank you for listening to me today, and that's the end of my...